Okay, so today we're going to talk about making sense of sensory strategies in Jewish education from the lens of beyond fidget spinners, because this conversation has really come to light in significant part because of both the popularity of and the backlash against fidget spinners as they've come up. So let's talk about sensory issues, myths and realities. So sensory awareness is amazingly helpful for both teachers and students. On the other hand, giving kids fidgets really doesn't make inclusion easy, doesn't even necessarily make it easier. Also, using sensory issues as a euphemism can really muddy the waters and make some conversations more complicated. And as always, we teach better when we're willing to acknowledge disability. So how is it that we're better teachers when we think about and take into account sensory experiences? Just writ large, we think about what our students are experiencing. Again, any of our students, how things feel to them, how the learning environment could be more physically comfortable, how engaging the senses could help students to learn better, and how might sensory strategies enable a wider range of learners to participate fully, right? So we think about that a lot these days, and like mixing up sensory modalities, using maybe music or movement or art to get students' attention. And this is really great for education, and it's not necessarily quite the same thing as thinking about disability and inclusion. So bracketing that, let's look at sensory strategies. So again, this is actually something that's universal and human. Everyone uses sensory strategies of some kind or other, because human beings aren't just made of words and ideas. We have bodies, and our bodies are important. They're an important part of our experiences and of our learning. And when we take that into account, we can teach better and we can learn better, right? So bodies are important, all of our senses are important. We all use sensory strategies to do things and understand things. The reason disability is important in this conversation is because it can impact which sensory strategies tend to be necessary, useful, and or effective. Not everything works for everyone in the same way. Not everyone has the same needs. So if you look in Jewish culture, and I've talked about this in other webinars, especially my using Jewish culture to understand autism and inclusion, Jewish culture uses a lot of sensory strategies. So in some ways, we've been ahead of the game, and education culture is just sort of catching up to how important this is. Like, we have a lot of multi-sensory things in our ritual, in our prayer, and how we communicate with each other. So in prayers, you know, one thing I say a lot is when I go into a synagogue, I'm never the only one rocking. We use music and repetition, varying noise and volume levels, wearing a tallis, sitting and standing, walking around in and out in prayers. So we do a lot of that kind of thing. Wearing a tallis affects the sensory experience of prayer. Wearing it over your head can shift certain kinds of focus. It's a sensory strategy, so it's pretty common in a lot of our communities. Holding pizzit, kind of similar to other things one might hold, like holding them, playing with them, looking at them. It can be focus in prayer, it can be praying with our whole body, it can be a symbol, it can be a lot of things, but it's certainly a sensory strategy that's very prevalent in Jewish culture. Music, in that the sensory experience of music carries meaning. And our prayers, again, even for a lot of us who don't necessarily understand the words. And there's musical transitions in prayers. We have an alternating often between shared and individual sensory experiences. Like, we might recite some things in unison, and some things might be responsive, some things might be us listening to the leader. So it's a very mix-up of sensory modalities of various kinds. You know, walking around and taking breaks is often acceptable in our communities. Rocking back and forth, never the only one. Does certain things for focus and shared experience. And this is really, in traditional Jewish education in the Beit Midrash, what do? People sit in the same place every day, rocking back and forth, talking in a sing-song voice about the same thing in the same basic position of the same person. And the texture of the Beit Midrash books and the way the room is set up from a sensory perspective are part of how the learning works. So sensory strategies are something that are really embedded within Jewish culture and Jewish learning. And we find ourselves in a situation where we also need to create new ones. So our tradition has given us a lot of super effective sensory strategies. And we don't necessarily have good ones for everyone or every situation. So let's think about, so the question we face as innovative, inclusive educators is, how do we invent our own sensory strategies for the educational problems that we're seeing? So in order to answer that, I want to look some at how sensory strategies work. I see, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I see two basic kinds of sensory strategies. There are sensory strategies that are about comfort, as in like making an environment or situation more comfortable, or even just getting it down to the point of tolerable. And then there's expansion strategies that are like harnessing sensory experiences to make things more effective or more possible. Some strategies do both. Everyone's got some. So here's some examples of comfort, some framing of comfort strategies. So comfort is important because pain is unpleasant and it's also distracting. It's bad to experience, and it also makes learning a lot harder. People are in pain, it's a lot harder to learn. Being comfortable can make a lot of things possible. And sensory awareness can allow us to make a situation more comfortable or less painful for ourselves or for those we're teaching. Comfort strategies can also sometimes relieve emotional or cognitive pain. It's not necessarily just about physical pain, but physical sensory strategies sometimes be a very effective form of pain relief for emotional and cognitive pain as well. So let's look at some common comfort-related sensory strategies. Setting the heater or air conditioner to a weather-appropriate temperature can be a very common sensory strategy. Wearing layers when you expect the temperature to change. Taking a deep breath to calm down. Rocking back and forth when things are overwhelming. Using noise-canceling headphones in noisy environments. Wearing shoes and socks that fit. Those are all sensory strategies that are about comfort or about making things tolerable. And again, some of these are nearly universal. Some of them are common. Some of them are more common among people with disabilities, but they're all sensory strategies. Comfort strategies are different for different people. Disability can mean that your experiences are significantly different because your body can be significantly different. Disability can mean that your body or brain hurts when other people are comfortable, sometimes for direct reasons, sometimes because differences in life experiences can also lead to different sources of emotional pain. We've talked about that before in webinars about trauma and discrimination and the lingering experiences of ableism, disability discrimination that matter in educational settings. So people can need strategies under circumstances. And a strategy that most people find comforting might be painful to other people. Not everyone feels comfort the same way. On the other hand, something that most people find unpleasant may be desired by someone whose sensory processing is different. People are different, and what matters is how something feels to the person experiencing it. So, sort of some thoughts on comfort strategies. Now, expansion strategies harness sensory experiences to make things more effective or more possible. For instance, like using a fidget to help yourself focus is an expansion strategy. Using a song to memorize something is also like a sensory expansion strategy. Another example, and this is one that I think is mostly associated with people who are not disabled, is for most people, making eye contact is an effective and important sensory strategy. Most people who are not disabled find it easier to pay attention when they are looking at someone's face. Most people find it easier to stay engaged in conversation with someone when they're looking them in the eye. Most people find it easier to feel respected and heard when someone's looking at their face. This is a sensory strategy. And it's not universal, and it does not work for everyone. So, many autistic people find that eye contact is impossible, painful, or destroys their ability to understand what people are saying to them. So being aware that even sensory strategies that are very culturally common and normative are not universal, and we shouldn't expect them to work when the way someone actually experiences them is different. So yeah, and another sensory strategy example, it's call and response is a sensory strategy for teaching. Sometimes teachers will have students repeat something in unison or recite a response to a prompt or sing a song together. This can be a very effective way for some people getting focus, maintain focus, or retaining information, or enabling a transition. Like when I lead a Seder, I'll sing Simane HaSeder to get people back on track, like Kadeh Shorchatz, etc. really says, okay, we're going on to the next thing. It's a sensory strategy, not universal, but very common and very often very effective. As an expansion strategy, when you think about sensory experience, it can make teaching go more smoothly. Another one that's common is having people stand to answer questions. Standing can direct focus, it can show whose turn it is, it can maintain certain energy. Doesn't work for everyone, and if you have someone for whom standing is not possible or not comfortable, you kind of have to rethink what the sensory strategy is going to be that's going to be inclusive. Another one that's pretty common is having libraries be quiet. Making libraries quiet is a sensory strategy for focus and seriousness and just avoiding distractions. It can also be a comfort strategy. Most people find it more comfortable to read in quiet spaces than noisy spaces. Again, not everyone, but this is something that we don't think of as a sensory strategy necessarily just because it's treated as so culturally normative, but it is, and it's a solution to a common sensory problem, and we can be innovative and think about strategies for other situations as well. So, okay, great. There's like sensory strategies are great. They're, everyone's got them. They're in some sense kind of universal. There's kind of an elephant in the room, and it's like those darn fidget spinners and what tends to happen when a room full of kids get a whole bunch of fidget toys. So it turns out, as I said at the beginning, giving people fidget toys really does not have the effect of causing inclusion to become easy. People still have disabilities when they also have fidget toys, and fidgets introduce a lot of complications. Classrooms full of fidgets are still classrooms full of really significant inclusion challenges. And even when it's a useful strategy, sometimes when you introduce fidgets, things might get harder for a while because every potential solution also introduces possible new problems. Another elephant in the room related to like what's come out of the fidget spinners conversation, the sensory issues conversation in our school writ large, is that sometimes sensory is really a euphemism. Sometimes we use it as a way of not talking about the things that really we need to. Sometimes we say sensory issues because it feels more acceptable than the real problem. Not everything that often gets called a sensory issue has anything to do with anything sensory. Sometimes we say sensory issues to avoid saying bad behavior or disruptiveness. Sometimes we say sensory issues as a way to avoid saying disability. And I think we really need to watch that, because if we want to get anywhere, we need to be honest, we need to identify problems accurately, and we need to make sure we're solving the right problem. Related to that, do fidgets work is the wrong question. Because fidgets aren't the strategy. Like asking, do fidgets work is like asking, do pencils work? And the answer is it depends. For me, for most people, pencils are very effective for writing. For me, pencils don't work because I can't use them effectively. So do fidgets work? It's not so black and white. Fidgets and other objects are really helpful for some people under some circumstances. They're really helpful for a lot of people under a lot of circumstances. They can be of make and break importance for some people, but they're not a universal solution to every problem. And they're rarely a simple solution to any problem, because anything powerful enough to work is powerful enough to have problems. Anything powerful enough to have effects is powerful enough to have side effects, right? Related to this, multisensory teaching is not the same as accessibility. We can't use talking about sensory stuff as a way around talking about disability. We've got to do both. Engaging kids with all their senses is a great and important teaching strategy, but it's not inherently more accessible or inclusive than anything else. And sometimes it actually creates new problems. So if we want to fully include kids with disabilities, we need to talk about accessibility and we need to talk about disability, because not everything's universal, and the things that are not universal are important. And we need to accept and acknowledge differences that stay significant, because a kid with a disability and a useful accessibility tool is not a kid who's no longer disabled. It's a kid who has both a disability and a strategy for accommodating it. There are no easy answers in inclusion. All this stuff is really complicated, which is why do fidget spinners work is the wrong question. Inclusion is often really hard. It takes a lot of trial and error. Being a person with a disability and figuring out how to do things is often hard and takes a lot of trial and error. Every potential solution to a problem can create new problems. So we need to keep trying, and we need to be kind. And we need to think about getting back to the elephant in the room, and not everything is a sensory issue. We can't let it become a euphemism. Not everything disruptive is an unmet sensory need. Sometimes you've got a different problem, and especially in Hebrew school, often it's a different problem. So when kids do stuff at school that teachers find disruptive, this can be a sign of sensory issues that need to be accommodated, but it can also be a sign of other problems. The only thing we know is that disruptiveness is an indication that there's a problem that we need to solve. Sometimes it's sensory, sometimes we have a different problem. For instance, sometimes when kids are disruptive, it's because our expectations are developmentally inappropriate. Like, if we expect a 5-year-old to sit through a 40-minute lecture, the reason that some of them can't do that and are disruptive is not that they have sensory issues and need fidgets. It's that we're expecting 5-year-olds to sit to do something that's not a developmentally appropriate expectation. Similarly, like people with, say, Tourette's syndrome or OCD might do disruptive things in ways that aren't really sensory issues. Some people have like medical conditions that cause frequent coughing, which is disruptive, but it's not something that can be fixed with a sensory strategy. You know, disruptiveness can also be frustration with confusing or impossible instructions, which is not a problem that can be solved with a sensory strategy, even if a kid also has sensory issues. Like, we have to realize, we have to not let sensory strategies become our only tool, because then we miss a lot of stuff that's really important. And another thing is, sometimes it's a sign of a kid not wanting to be at Hebrew school and therefore being disruptive, because Hebrew school is such a difficult educational setting for kids, families, and for educators. And so my hat is off to anyone willing to take that on. But I'd also say not wanting to be at camp, not wanting to be at Yahadut, at Judaic programming within camp, not wanting to be anywhere can be a thing, but especially in Hebrew school, there's a lot that gets put on it that makes it a very challenging setting. And I think it's important to keep sight of the fact that it's not your fault that that's the case. It's, you know, no matter how good you are as an educator, Hebrew school is just hard. And that's okay, and it doesn't mean you're bad, it means you're brave. So one thing that can happen is that sometimes the issue is identity. Kids and families often have very complicated feelings about the burdens of being Jewish. And kids who go to Hebrew school know that their non-Jewish peers don't have to go. and that most of them don't have to think about the Holocaust or about Hamas or terrorism or whether the state of Israel will survive or any number of things that Jewish kids have to think about, and non-Jewish kids often are considered too young to think about those things. So when a kid is working through conflicting feelings about what it means to be Jewish and the price Jews pay for being Jewish, it can really come out as disruptiveness in Jewish settings, especially when that is the most concrete thing in their life that embodies the burdens of being Jewish. And when that's the problem, treating it as a sensory issue is likely to make the problem worse. So, and another way the problem is identity is that Jewish kids with disabilities have 3 identity problems. They have the issue of forming a Jewish identity they can own in a world that's still often anti-Semitic, forming a disability identity and incorporating their disability into their identity in an ableist world that says that it is not okay to be disabled, and dealing with how to have a Jewish identity as a disabled person. And that gets really complicated and can manifest in, disruptiveness or, reluctance or various other difficult things. And even for people who have sensory issues, when the issue is identity, a sensory strategy often will not help very much. So just keeping in mind that it's not necessary. Some things are sensory issues, some are not. Some things are technical access and accommodation issues, and some of them are identity issues or more complex emotional things. And these problems can have overlapping solutions, but we need to remember that they're different problems and have space to hold that in our problem solving. So sensory strategies are not the right solution to every problem. Sometimes kids need clearer instructions or accommodations for motor skills impairments, or work on a more appropriate level for them, which could mean that they need easier work. It could mean that they need harder work. Could mean they need large print, medication, or a different teaching strategy. But sometimes what they need is long-term trust building and patience, or emotional scaffolding, or help working through the identity stuff. Sometimes people need all of these things. Sometimes stuff is really complicated and it's just hard to tell. But having as many strategies in your toolbox as possible, including patience and remembering that working trust building takes time, and including sensory stuff. So why is it that giving people fidget toys doesn't necessarily make inclusion easier and doesn't necessarily simplify things? One reason is, giving a room full of distracted kids fidget spinners does not get you a room full of kids who are paying attention to you. Fidgets introduce their own complications. Tools don't create skills. Disability and accessibility can be very complicated. So how does disability affect sensory strategies? Again, everyone uses them. We all use them when we're teaching. And there's been tremendous attention to innovation in sensory strategies in the last 5 years or so. So one more thing, realizing that attending to sensory issues is not a substitute for thinking about disability and accessibility, question arises, how does disability affect sensory strategies? So the key thing to keep in mind is that people with disabilities have bodies and brains that work differently. Bodies stay important when they're different, and some strategies that work for most non-disabled people may not work for someone with a disability. Someone with a disability may need sensory strategies that most people don't need. So here's some different ways sensory things can manifest. So there's sensory disabilities in the sense of, say, blindness or deafness or, paralysis or something. But there's also sensory issues, processing issues that are brain-based rather than body-based. So sensory organs might be typically functioning, but sensory experiences are not. For instance, some people who have technically normal hearing need captions enabled in order to be able to understand and follow the plot of a movie. Somebody might have, for instance, 20/20 vision, but also get visually disoriented in a crowd. And some people have both types of impairment, both like direct sensory impairment and sensory processing. And it's not always either possible or important to tell which is which, but it's worth realizing that this is a real thing. Otherwise, it could get confusing when somebody is obviously not deaf, but they also can't understand videos without captions or whatever. So just be aware that this is part of how sensory issues can manifest. So differences in sensory experience need to be taken into account when you're thinking about making your instructional sensory strategies inclusive. Since the effectiveness of sensory strategies depends on how things feel in our experience. So if they feel different, the strategy might not work. So if you're, for instance, using musical transitions in your classroom or activity, which is a strategy I highly recommend with most groups, it works really well in a lot of settings, but music probably won't help people focus if it feels painfully loud, or if somebody finds, like, say, a certain beat or tonal range painful or derailing. So thinking about what people are actually experiencing is part of how you make your sensory instructional strategies inclusive. Similarly, like most visual strategies won't work for most blind people. It's not universal because some blind people do have some vision and do use some of it for visual strategies, but most things you have to take into account sensory experience when you're thinking about what sensory strategies are likely to be effective for the group you're working with. Another thing to be aware of in terms of difference in sensory experience is the issue of sensory overload. So many people with disabilities experience sensory overload. This is really common in, say, autistic people, but not just autistic people. Like, it's pretty common for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. So sensory overload is when there's too much overwhelming sensory input and it's painful or disorienting and prevents you from understanding or engaging things. And often this happens in circumstances where other people aren't bothered by the stimuli or aren't very bothered by them. So it's not like there's this objectively overloading thing. It's what a particular person finds overloading. There's some things that are common. For instance, if you're in a summer camp and you have loud, raucous singing, during meals or after, thinking about the impact that's having on kids who are very sensitive to being surrounded with loud, overwhelming noise is, important and kind. But there are some things that are more idiosyncratic, and it's not always necessarily just loud spaces. Some people are actually more overloaded by loud spaces than by quiet spaces. More overloaded by quiet spaces than by loud spaces, because when you're in a library, any little noise feels really loud and echoey. So for some people, quiet spaces can be more of a problem because it makes all those noises feel really loud and echoey. Also, a lot of people find it overloaded to be sitting in the center of a room, even if the room isn't loud. Some people feel like much more comfortable near a wall, even if the room is quiet. So that's just something to be aware of. So here's some common strategies that a lot of people use for managing sensory overload. Some people like to wear noise canceling headphones. And if you're in a setting where you can, I would highly recommend getting some noise canceling kind of headphones and just making them available and offering them to people, because a lot of times when people have them available, they find that it's a good strategy that works for them. Doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't happen to work for me because I hate the way they feel on my head. But a lot of times I'll put in earbuds even when I'm not listening to music, just because it makes the noise less loud. You know, some people will say wrap themselves in a blanket or sheet, because when you have, say, a different kind of sensory input, it can make the overwhelm easier to deal with. Or rocking back and forth, using a fidget or grounding object, sitting on the edge of a room rather than the middle. For some people, taking breaks, being able to take a break means that you can kind of, let your senses calm down a little and get back to it. And another thing that's a really good thing to keep in mind is making sure that flickering bulbs in your instructional spaces are replaced promptly. And that whenever you go to a new instructional space, one good thing to find out when you're orienting is where the light bulbs are and who can change them, because flickering bulbs are a huge problem for a wide range of people, and you probably have someone in your group for whom flickering bulbs are a problem, and maybe it's you, because I know I'm a better teacher when I fix the light bulb. That said, well, breaks are a really important strategy, and I absolutely encourage you to incorporate a way for yourselves and your students to take sensory breaks when they need them. There's one caution I want to offer about that, because while people who experience sensory overload often need to take breaks, they also need to be welcome in spaces they find overloading. And a person using a visible sensory strategy, like say covering their ears, isn't necessarily someone who needs to leave. Sometimes it's what they're doing in order to stay. And I'm mentioning this because I found, as someone with a lot of sensory issues and as someone whose movement and embodiment is different than most people's, when people have been trained about sensory issues, if they see that a space is loud and they see me rocking back and forth and covering my ears or whatever, they'll often get really worried and say are you okay? Do you need to leave? My response is, no, I need to stay. And this is how I'm staying. So just be aware that breaks need to be in your repertoire, but people also need to be welcome when they're using sensory strategies that are visible. Sometimes I know that I'm just not going to be comfortable in a given space, but I really want to be there. So sometimes my goal is tolerance. And it's a lot easier to tolerate a space if it's okay to make my discomfort visible and for people to know that I'm actually okay. And so sometimes this takes some negotiation and trust building, but don't presume that visibility means that a break is needed or desired. So I'm thinking about different experiences in general. Same space or activity may be experienced very differently by students with and without disabilities. Again, for sensory reasons, but not just for sensory reasons. For instance, even if there's no sensory difference involved, if you're playing, say, red light, green light, or Gaga, or something, and you have a kid who moves much more slowly than the other kids, they're going to be experiencing that activity differently. Even if they don't particularly have sensory issues, they are having a different experience. And sometimes sensory strategies can be helpful for people who are having different experiences, even if it's not per se a sensory issue. For instance, if somebody faces inaccessible activities a lot, which a lot of kids do, a stress ball might help them deal with that. Even if it's not that they have a sensory need for sensory feedback, it's that it helps them get out some of that frustration. Similarly, someone with memory impairments might benefit from sensory mnemonic strategies, like say, color coding or singing or something. And it's not because of a sensory issue, it's because of a memory issue. But thinking about how senses can be used to accommodate a disability can be really helpful, even from the perspective of it not being a sensory issue. Like, sensory strategies, everybody uses them, they can be helpful for a very wide range of problems, disability related and not. So let's talk about those fidgets and STEM toys. One thing to be aware of is that the education community tends to use the language of fidgets or fidget toys or fidget tools. The autistic community tends to call these handheld useful objects STEM toys. So if you're looking for a firsthand autistic perspective on these kinds of things, Googling STEM toys is a better search term than fidgets, because if you Google fidgets, you'll mostly find educator perspective or ADHD perspective. And this is just an aside. I don't think one type of language is better than the other. It's just worth knowing. So let's look at some uses of fidgets and STEM toys. So one way, there are a lot of them. One way people might use them is in order to maintain focus and reduce distractibility, and we'll talk about how that works some in a bit. Another way someone might use them is to engage in constant movement to maintain body awareness or voluntary movement. Some people, if they're moving constantly, find it much easier to tell where their body is in space. Some people with various types of motion disorders find that if they want to be able to control their body and be able to do things like write and raise their hand, it works a lot better if they're doing continuous intentional movements rather than trying to sit still and then start moving it on purpose again. And if you don't experience, it's a bit hard to describe. Just like be aware that it's a thing and it's not a sensory issue per se. Another thing they can be useful for is a pleasant sensory focus as a distraction from physical or emotional pain. And we'll talk about distraction a bit too. Another way they can be really useful is something that stays the same across contexts and remains familiar in unfamiliar environments. So this is, for those of you who work in summer camp settings, summer camp can be really chaotic, and it can involve a lot of constantly shifting activities and environments. And so for some people, having the same thing with them all the time can make it feel a lot less disorienting. So, whether you're having like on a surprise field trip or in your Jewish studies block or in sport or in this other surprise activity, with all this stuff going on around you, no matter where you are, you have this familiar object that you can use in a familiar way. And sometimes that in and of itself is really helpful in constantly shifting inaccessible, unfamiliar environments. Which is one reason why for some people, these are not interchangeable. And it really does have to be, say, their fidget spinner or that one stuffed animal or that one chewy toy or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways people use these things. And it's worth knowing that there's a pretty wide range of uses for them. Another thing is that some sensory strategies involve being distracting too, but distracted is what I said. So, we talk a lot about, in the conversation about fidgets, before fidget spinners got popular, the conversation we had was often, for some people, fidgeting really helps with focus. So if we just let people use fidgets and make them available, a lot of people will be able to focus better. And then teachers, notice the obvious truth that sometimes people are really distracted by these things. And I think that we need to back up a little and say, sometimes people are distracted and that's a problem. Sometimes people are distracted and that's actually a good thing and integral to how the strategy works. For instance, sensory toys, like say a fidget spinner, could be something people use to distract themselves from a PTSD trigger in order to avoid a panic attack. I actually met some art therapists who work in northern Israel with kids and educators who kind of live under constant rocket fire. One thing they talked to me about was that they actually teach people to do this. They teach teachers to set things up so that if a kid is like experiencing a trigger or that kind of fear, they actually tell them, go use this sensory toy to distract yourself from that for a while, and it'll like help you calm down. And they also use, like, when kids are in ambulances, these sensory things to distract them and help them like not get overwhelmed in a dangerous way. So like distracting yourself from a trigger in order to avoid having a full-blown panic attack can be a really great use of these things. In that case, yes, they're distracting, and that's good. Distracting yourself from pain can also be a way that they're useful, like from sensory overload or from like something being humiliating. Like distraction from pain can be a very necessary and useful strategy. Another way a distraction strategy can be good is it can allow you to take a brief sensory break without actually having to leave the room. So, you might be able to say, take out your fidget spinner, spin it, focus on it for a while in ways that kind of block out the way that the room is loud, bright, and chaotic, in a way that allows you to still stay in the room and not be distracted for longer than you have to be, and not need to leave and miss stuff. And that's something that, I certainly have strategies for that work along those lines. Or filtering out background noise. Or another way is it can be a way to refocus. Say, if you're getting distracted by an off-topic conversation with your peers or that you're overhearing, distracting yourself with a distracting object can be a way of like getting yourself out of paying attention to that conversation and back into focusing on what you want to be focusing on. So, so sometimes they're distracting and that's bad, and sometimes they're distracting and that's good. And it's certainly the case that they are not like magical fidget focus potions. It depends on what the problem is. It depends on how they're used. Okay. And so a reason why grounding objects are helpful is that, they can help you to understand that you're in the present in a safe situation and not in a dangerous situation you're remembering. And this can look real similar to the way people use fidgets for focus or sensory input. But it's not necessarily the same thing. And again, you're not necessarily going to know which is which. But if you know that someone has a trauma history, it's a significant possibility that what they're doing with their, fidget stimulus, whatever, is not about sensory issues so much as a sensory strategy for trauma. Again, not universal, but common. So in Jewish terms, one might understand grounding objects as a form of, we say about the Torah, it is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. When we go up and take an aliyah at the Torah and hold on to it and say, like, talk about holding fast to the tree of life, I think grounding objects that help people realize that they're not in this scary, traumatic, dangerous situation in the present really serve similar functions. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. It's also a tree of life for people who are experiencing overwhelming pain or overload of a more physical nature. But these are important, and there's like something sacred about this, even though it can be really difficult to deal with in other ways. And I think that understanding the sanctity of it can kind of help us to deal with the ways that it can also be frustrating and difficult to accommodate as an educator. So another thing is, so there's distraction strategies and there's focus strategies. But sometimes the distraction is actually part of what makes it work for focus, which is a reason why skills for using these things matter. So some focus strategies involve distraction from other distractions. So fidgets can mean that you focus on one distraction instead of a zillion. And if you're dialing it down to one distraction, that can leave you with focus and brain power available to pay attention to class or to understand what's going on around you. And it means calibrating the right amount of distraction can really take a lot of trial and error. And so a fidget that distracts someone in disruptive ways can also be their best available focus tool. And that's part of what I meant by tools don't create skills. Like, and it's not a potion. It's like there are a lot of ways that objects can be very useful in being able to think clearly or tolerate an environment or any number of other things. But having a useful object is not the same as being able to use it. And you know, and people aren't born knowing how to use it, and particularly when somebody's focus strategy involves distracting themselves from distractions, it's gonna take a lot of trial and error to figure out how to, like, what's the right amount of distraction? Like, how do you make it distract you from the distractions, but not the thing that you're supposed to be paying attention to? And most people who use that kind of strategy do not use it perfectly. And sometimes, sometimes their strategy, fails and ends up being distracting to them. But that doesn't mean that they don't need it or that it's the wrong tool. Sometimes it just means that it needs skills that they don't have yet that are not always totally easy to learn. So related to that, sensory objects are not interchangeable. And this is something I wanted to mention because, again, in this sort of sensory strategies 2.0 conversation I've been seeing in the wake of like wide adoption of fidgets and problems with fidget spinners, is that people will say, well, I don't let them have fidget spinners because those are toys. I let them have like this memory foam or a strip of Velcro on their desk or some other thing. And if they really need it, they can use that. And the problem with that is that people who need sensory objects often need specific sensory objects because the need is often more complicated than they need something to fidget with. And it's true that for a lot of people, Velcro on your desk will work better than a fidget spinner for focus. It's not true that that they're not interchangeable, and the fact that somebody really needs it doesn't necessarily mean that your preferred fidget will work for them. So like people who use rocks you can't assume that people who use rocks could just as easily use silly putty or a piece of foam. Like for me, like what I was taught to use in elementary school was silly putty, and that never worked well for me. But for me, like rocks are kind of magic, but also tend to annoy people. And I get it. I don't like being annoying, but knowing that something is annoying does not in and of itself give you the capacity to do a strategy that others would prefer. So is to say, like, it can take a lot of trial and error to figure out what will work. And once you've figured out something that would work, and once you figured out something that would work and developed the skills to use it effectively, having to start over with a different thing can mean you're back to square one in terms of skills. And again, that's not always true. Some people who can use one thing can just as easily use another thing. And it's a strategy worth considering when a particular kind of object seems to not be working or seems to be a problem. It's just worth knowing that they're not interchangeable, and having a real problem doesn't necessarily mean that another object will work. So in terms of fidget spinners, again, the question, do fidget spinners work, is the wrong question because it depends on context. So for most people, not all people, fidget spinners are distracting. Most people focus on the spinner while they're spinning it. For most people, fidget spinners tend to be more useful for distraction strategies than focus strategies. But I do know a couple of people who find that they're useful for focus as well, for like blocking other stuff out. But most people I know who use these kinds of strategies so that fidget spinners work better for distraction strategies than focus strategies. And again, distraction strategies are not necessarily bad. But if the objective is to gain the ability to listen to a conversation, and you're looking for a focus-based strategy, for most people, other things are likely to work better. Like doodling might work better, string might work better, or any number of other things. But it's not that they're bad, it's that they're not necessarily the right tool for every job. I bought one of my fidget spinners from a place that like suggested, it's a great focus thing. You can use it instead of coffee while you're driving. Say, like, please don't drive while you're using a fidget spinner. It's not going to end well. But they can be really great for distracting yourself from something that's triggering, or taking a sensory break without having to leave. Or for a few people, they're good focus tools. Especially for people who rely a lot on like visual input, blocking out visual input as a way of being able to process auditory input. But again, it's about finding the right tools and the right skills for the job. The other thing is that unfortunately, disruptive and necessary are not opposites. And I'm mentioning this because I've heard a lot of people say like that they have a no flying fidgets rule, and like, if you throw it, I'm taking it. And I totally get why teachers would want to have that rule. And I could even get why that is an appropriate rule for some people in some contexts. But I also know that as somebody with significant movement problems, who uses objects to gain like voluntary motion, I've involuntarily thrown a lot of things. I think like a lot of people with a lot of disorders have involuntarily thrown a lot of things. And it's not that I was playing with it, or that I didn't really need it, or that I didn't know that it's not nice to throw things. It's that my hands don't always work very well. And, the tools that work for me are pretty disruptive when they're thrown. So, disruptive and necessary, unfortunately, aren't opposites. Kids can use anything to be disruptive. Anything. Sensory tools are no exception. And it's not that sensory tools are disruptive, it's that kids are disruptive. Just like any other school supplies, kids will play with them and use them inappropriately sometimes. And kids aren't born knowing how to use them. And kids develop skills over time for using them appropriately. Kids who write with pencils will not use them correctly 100% of the time, and people who need sensory tools will not use them correctly 100% of the time. It's not that the tools are bad, it's that kids are kids, and sometimes we got to work stuff out. And when we're introducing stuff in, there can be growing pains in terms of figuring out effective ways to teach people how to use them, including people who are pretty inevitably going to end up doing things that are disruptive, either because they're kids and kids do that, or because sometimes being disabled means that what you need is going to be disruptive. And I also want to point out in this regard that we expect kids with disabilities to tolerate a lot of distracting and disruptive things. And I think that sometimes we need to reciprocate it a bit more, and to say that like part of being in community together is that sometimes we're going to make each other uncomfortable, and it can take some working out. And but people who need things that are sometimes disruptive are still part of our community and part of our class. Just like sometimes sometimes the autistic kids have to tolerate lights they don't like, or places that are too loud, or activities that are too socially intense. Maybe sometimes like other people need to be able to, tolerate distracting noises, because, when we put all of the disabled distracting kids together in like special ed, we expect them to tolerate each other and their distractiveness, and they're the most distracted sensitive often. So I think it's not unreasonable to expect like some mutuality there where, you know, sometimes it being distracting is just kind of something we deal with because that's how we're in community together. And so I'll just conclude with the importance of trial and error. Disability doesn't come with a manual. It's not always possible for teachers or for people with disabilities it's not always easy for us to find solutions to accessibility problems. In the short term, there might not be a solution. Even the best strategies don't always work 100% of the time. And we need to keep in mind that it's even harder for students who are living without access. We need to keep trying, and we need to understand that it's hard because it's new and because we haven't attended to it as much in the past. It's not that sensory strategies are bad or problematic or disruptive. It's that we're still working some stuff out about how to do these things in a way that will work. And so I see we're at time. I'm looking at the chat. I haven't seen any yet, but does anyone have questions or comments at this point? I'm gonna stop my slides just to make sure I'm not
Amy, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. No, I just wanted to know if it's, maybe you already mentioned this in some email, I don't remember, but I think this is a really helpful presentation. I would love to be able to figure out a way to use it for staff training and development. And is it possible to get either a copy, hard copy, or just a copy via computer of the presentation? And is there somebody at Matan who either Rabbi Ruti or somebody else who does travel around and do this presentation?
So first of all, okay, I need to, not sure where that audio is coming from. So first of all, thank you. I'm glad that this was helpful. And we'll be sending out a recording once we get it captioned. You should have received a link to the slides, and I am available to go teach within communities, and so are some of the other Matan staff.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question or comment? Okay. So let's go ahead and stop here. Our next webinar will be on inclusion considerations for youth and family services for Yamim Noraim, and you should be getting some information about that shortly. All right. Thank you, everyone.